Okay, the chat says that we're live.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to Primate Conversations. My name is René Bobet, and it's a real pleasure to have Robyn Pickering with us. We have been waiting for Robyn to give a talk to our group for quite some time, so we're delighted that she's able to join us today. Robyn is a senior lecturer in the Department of Geological Sciences at the University of Cape Town. She has a PhD in geology from the University of Bern, 2009, and prior to that, she did her studies at WITS in South Africa. Her work has been focused primarily, although not exclusively, in South Africa, and it has focused mostly on uranium series dating, but with repercussions for various aspects of archaeology and paleoanthropology. I would say that prior to Robyn's work, it has been traditionally very difficult to have a firm understanding of the dates of the caves in South Africa, as that region lacks the volcanic ash layers that we have all over Eastern Africa that are so easy to date comparatively with potassium-argon and argon-argon methods. But her work has really focused on the dating of flow stones and thus the sedimentary sequences in the Cradle of Humankind. And this has been really critical, I think, in a way, if I may say, this work has sort of revolutionized the way that we understand the South African sites and how they fit into the framework of human evolution. This work has made it possible to get a much more firm understanding of the chronological ages of various hominins and other mammalian species, as well as the timing of key developments in human evolution. And there's very important information that she has been able to provide about paleoenvironments in Southern Africa and patterns of speciation and extinction. Now, this work also has allowed, in a way, establishing a framework for the sites in the Cradle of Humankind, where these are no longer isolated occurrences, but we can understand them now as more of a developing series of ecosystems. So, with this, I would like to leave you with Robyn, and welcome, Robyn. We're very much looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you, René. Thank you for such a lovely introduction. It's a bit overwhelming. And yeah, thank you to you and Susanna for the invitation to speak in this series. I've followed your Primate Conversation series, particularly on Twitter for the last couple of years. So I was really honored and delighted at the invitation to speak in the series. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking, as René said, I am at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. I'm the co-director of the Human Evolution Research Institute, and I sit in the Department of Geological Sciences. And today I'm going to talk to you about the sort of state of human evolution and my work, particularly in dating human evolution in South Africa. And so, by way of introduction, these sort of caves, carbonates, and decolonization. So I'm a geologist, and my research focuses on carbonate rocks, which are terrestrial, CaCO3 carbonates. There's two main field areas which I work in South Africa, and one in the Cradle of Humankind and the other in the Southern Kalahari Basin. And they're both these areas have a rich record of human evolution. And then the other thing that I do in particular is the chronology, working out how old things are. And my speciality is dating the carbonate rocks. And to do this, I use the uranium series chronometer. So both the uranium thorium and the uranium lead dating method. So my research interests kind of lie at the intersection of the development of uranium series chronology, because the chronometer is constantly evolving itself. and understanding the depositional environments of carbonates. But in 2022, sitting in South Africa, I feel like I can't not talk about the kind of really political and the context that we find ourselves in, which is something we talk a lot about at the University of Cape Town, and something which I haven't spoken a lot in public about before. So this is not easy for me, but I'm going to try and talk about the way these sort of three Venn diagrams overlap. So decolonization is defined as the writing back against ongoing colonialism and colonial mentalities that permeate all institutions and systems of government. So as researchers working at universities, we're not immune from the context in which our science is taking place. And things like neo-colonialism and the big decolonial movement taking place at somewhere like the University of Cape Town has an impact on who does research and how we do that. And I'm going to try and talk about this at the end of my talk today. But to start off with, we'll go into the field. So this is a map of a sort of a portion of the African continent and the well-known early human fossil sites that Renee and others have worked at, and we have an incredible record from, run all the way down the East African rift system from Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and the other single richest place where we find early human fossils is in South Africa, and marked on the map in the two red, let's get my cursor, here we have the Cradle of Humankind, and then this is the Southern Kalahari Basin and the site of Gamagana, which I will talk about in the middle of this talk. But here, this is a field photograph of what the Cradle of Humankind looks like today. This is what the Southern Kalahari looks like. And this is a sort of an insert of this quite small area of the Cradle of Humankind. It's about 10 by 20 kilometers. And the dolomite host rock is full of the eroded remnants of caves. And inside these caves, we find sediments which have fossils preserved in them. The minority of these fossils are hominin fossils. And as Renee was saying in his very generous introduction, this is a very different geological setting to the East African rift. There's no volcanic ash layers. So for a long time, the South African deposits were really viewed as undatable. But the good news is that that basically is not the case. So there's no volcanoes and volcanic ash layers, but we do get a specific type of rock which only forms in a cave. And these are called speleotherms. So speleothem just means cave rock. And this is a cave carbonate. And this is a very young, enthusiastic version of me. I think that photo was taken in 2003. So I haven't ever given a public lecture without showing this photograph. And the reason I'm looking so excited is that this is a modern cave. You have stalactites coming down from the ceiling, stalagmites from the floor, and this wet, dark layer on the floor of the cave near my feet is a flowstone. So a flowstone is the horizontally bedded layer of this calcium carbonate material, which literally flows out on the cave floor. And in some of the fossil caves, this is Bolt's Farm. It's my colleague Andy HERI's. And here, these are the fossil-bearing sediments, which are typically reddish-brown. The little white specks are bones. And then we get these huge flowstone layers, and we get these interbedding, literally a layer cake of flowstone sediment. And much has been made of the complexity of the caves in the Cradle of Humankind, that the geology was too complicated and almost unknowable. But the end member components of what we find in the caves are actually very simple. We find flowstone, calcium carbonate, and these externally derived reddish-brown sediments where we find the bones. And actually all the caves, there's nuances and cave-specific stories at each one of the localities. But in general, this is the pattern that we see everywhere. So these flowstones are really ubiquitous features in the cradle, and they can be incredibly thick. They can be over 1 meter thick or just a few centimeters. And there's two key things about the flowstones. So the one is that the depositional environment is very specific. You need a positive water balance inside the cave, which basically just means it needs to be raining more outside the cave. So this equates to a period of time with increased effective precipitation where it's raining more, and you have a decrease of material being washed into the cave, because the flowstones are pretty fussy. If these growth surfaces get interrupted by dirt or animals or bones, they'll actually stop forming. So to find a flowstone as thick as this implies that the cave was pretty much closed to external sediment for a long time. Then the other big thing, the second useful thing about these speleotherms, particularly the flowstones, as well as things like stalagmites, is that we can date them. So for this, we're using the uranium series chronometer, which is based on the natural radioactivity of uranium-238. And this chronometer is very well established. It's the reason we know the age of the Earth, and it's normally applied to zircons, so to small microscopic silicate minerals. But this is a zircon-free zone, not dating zircons. This application of both uranium thorium and uranium lead dating is actually to the carbonates themselves. And this is a photo micrograph of one of the speleotherms from the cradle. And this here you can see individual calcite crystals. And at the time of formation, as this calcite forms, the uranium gets locked into crystals on a sort of crystal by crystal basis. And the mechanism of the chronometer is based on the huge solubility difference between uranium and its daughter isotopes in groundwater. And this is that uranium is incredibly soluble in groundwater. And so as the calcium carbonate crystals form from the meteoric waters percolating through the ground rock, the bedrock, you get uranium locked into the carbonates. But thorium and lead, the daughter isotopes, are basically completely insoluble in water, so you don't have any of them. So you get this disequilibrium, this breaking of the uranium series, which means that the uranium, you only have uranium locked into the crystals, and it begins its in situ decay, and you basically start the clock ticking. That from as this uranium decays and you get the buildup of thorium and lead, we can measure how much thorium there is and how much lead there is from that amount of uranium, and solve the decay equations and work out the unknown, which is time. And I spent a lot of time in my PhD looking for uranium in carbonates from the cradle, because the uranium is not evenly distributed. And this is a phosphor scanning image of a stalagmite. It's a little bit analogous to an X-ray, where these dark layers are kind of growth horizons within the stalagmite. And the darker the layer, the more uranium there is. And you need about 1 part per million of uranium to have measurable lead and uranium. So that's probably the only thing I really discovered in my PhD, was that you need to target these uranium-rich layers. And once you've done that, you can identify the layer on an actual piece of flowstone and cut out these little blocks of carbonate and measure in my case, uranium and lead to date them. And the motivation for going to all this trouble is really to date the layers of sediment that are sandwiched in between the flowstones. So this is the site of Swartkrans, and here we have a flowstone layer. It's not continuous, it's pretty patchy, but there's a flowstone at the base of this pile of sediment. Here's the fossil-bearing sediments of the hanging remnant, and up here there's a patchy little bit of flowstone capping it off. And the uranium lead ages was 2.2 million at the bottom and 1.8 at the top. The motivation for getting these ages is to work out how old the sediments are in between. And in these sediments, we find mainly isolated teeth, but really incredible, partial skeletons like Australopithecus sediba. So as a chronologist and as someone who was involved in the early development of the uranium lead dating technique to make it applicable to carbonates, my colleague John Woodhead and I are sort of mildly obsessed with the quality of the age data and how well our chronometer is working. So this is an old plot. This plot is 10 years old. It's from 2012. And this was just taking all of John and my data. So this was around 50 uranium lead ages and which equated to about 500, paired uranium and lead analyses, which is a lot. That's years in the laboratory. And these are plotted on a logarithmic scale. And this is the percentage, 2 sigma uncertainty. And this line is a sort of 10% uncertainty. So the majority of our ages fall below this, which is all right. If you think about something like OSL, optically stimulated luminescence, you're typically getting around 10% errors on your ages. This is the 1% mark. So quite a lot of if you're doing uranium thorium ages, you would expect less than 1% error. So this is great for uranium lead that we can achieve such precision. But as I said, this is an old plot. So, what do you do in a pandemic when you are stuck at home and you can't do any field work or any lab work? You write review papers. So John Engel, who's John Woodhead's newly graduated PhD student, and I wrote a review paper together where we put all of our PhD data together. So John's work from South Australia and my work from South Africa. And we combined all of these analyses, and we didn't use any of John Woodhead's analysis because the John Woodhead effect is John seems to just produce the most beautiful data, while John Engel and I have very problematic data, which makes it more interesting. But we actually wanted to look at the sort of ugly data and zoom in on that and try and understand what was happening. And yeah, this is just a little histogram of, we had 68 combined analyses. And this is a pretty technical plot, but there's a lot of black dots and a lot of red dots. And there's 2 components in calculating a uranium lead age. And one is the slope of the isochron that we use, and the other is the common lead intercept. And we certainly anticipated that the common lead would be controlling the quality of the ages. That's what we were expecting. And lead contamination is the biggest problem that we deal with. There's more lead in a fingerprint than many of our samples. So that's what we were anticipating. But as you can see, these black dots are the common lead intercepts, and it just flatlines completely. So showing that there's no relationship between the precision on the age and the amount of common lead. And this here is the slope of the isochron, and that controls the age quality. So this was not something that John and I were particularly expecting to see, and it's quite difficult to control the slope. So yeah, we have tried to come up with some explanations for this in our quaternary geochronology paper if anyone is super interested. But then I suppose I wasn't really ready to let go of this quality of the age data question. So with my colleague Tara Edwards, we wrote another review paper in 2020, also looking into the quality of the age data. So what we did in this paper is we took Tara's PhD data and mine as well, and we just looked at the ages from the cradle. And here this was the age going from 0 to 3.5 million. And this again is the 2 sigma error. And we classified them into good ages, which is, up to 5% error. Bad, we gave ourselves bad the cutoff at between 5 to 10%, and above 10% error, we classified as ugly. And what we were actually interested in was these samples up here? Like, what is going on? Why do some speleotherms give us bad dates? Like, what is the problem? And as you can see from these other plots, we plotted pretty much everything against everything. And things like the amount of uranium, the amount of lead, the uranium isotopic composition, none of these have very much of a relationship on the age, which, yeah, we were hoping would be a kind of golden bullet as to explain why some samples work so well and others don't. So what we then did is take a deep dive into the digenesis of the speleotherms. So this is the kind of post-depositional modification, which is like an ugly word. People who work on stalagmites don't like to talk about digenesis. And these are photomicrographs that Tara took of the various textures we see in the flowstones. And here you can see beautiful original calcite crystals. But all of these textures are diagenetic. So there's actually a very strong diagenetic signal in all of these samples. So that made us pretty nervous. But then to test to what extent digenesis is actually an issue, we looked at the trace element signals. So this is quite a complicated plot, but here we have little pieces of flowstone. This is a centimeter, that's 3 centimeters. So these slices of speleothem, all of these have been dated, and we've got an ugly age, a bad age, and a good age here. And we were just looking at the magnesium, strontium, barium, and uranium, as well as the lead and thorium concentrations, which we measured by using laser ablation. And we found 3 main patterns. We do here find a pattern. So in the samples that have good ages with precise, where we get good precision, we get these very clear step-like patterns in the water-soluble trace elements. And we took this to mean that there has been some digenesis, but it's very mild, and it hasn't caused the mobilization of trace elements. And uranium is a trace element. And we wouldn't, if the uranium had been mobilized, remobilized, we would see these kind of diffusion gradients and smeared out patterns, which is the opposite of what we see. We see step-like patterns. So this suggests that digenesis takes place very early, shortly after formation, and that something like the big uranyl ion is locked in place and is not moving around, which means that even mild digenesis is not having an effect on the age. Then the bad samples had something missing. So here we have very low concentrations of lead, which means that the lead is difficult to measure, which contributes to the error. The uranium is also low in concentration, which again makes it hard to measure, but we're still seeing these step-like signals. So again, digenesis is not the problem here. But then this sample here, which is from the site of Haasvat, which is ugly, and this is the isochron, and this is the ugliest data that you'll ever see. You'll never see a uranium lead chronologist publishing or showing an isochron in public like this. This is horrible. And there's, the MSWD is over 400. There's no age solution. This is terrible data. But we were fascinated with the sample. We were like, why is it so ugly? And if you look here at the trace elements, there's just noise. They're incredibly noisy. There's no step-like patterns. The concentrations are all very low. And what we interpret this as is complete digenesis, so like a complete overprinting and mobilization. And this is undateable. So the problem is that on the flowstones look the same. There's no way to visually tell them apart, but we can explain from digenesis and the trace element distribution what has happened. So that's the sort of ongoing technique development. And I was telling you about this because I really wanted to make the point that the uranium lead chronometer is not static. Getting it to work in the cradle was a big deal, but we're still kind of tweaking the method and still trying to work out how to get it to work even better and why it sometimes doesn't work. So this is another very busy slide. This is like my whole PhD on a slide. But here we have the Cradle of Humankind with each one of these fossil-bearing localities. These are the simplified stratigraphy. So at all of these sites, you have a flowstone underlaying fossil-bearing sediments and a flowstone capping it off. There are, as I said, site-specific nuances, but it is actually possible to take a very simplistic view of the geology at these sites, and it actually makes your life a lot easier if you do this. And then by 2011, 2012, we had uranium-laid ages for Swartkrant, Sterkfontein, Malapa, and Coopers, so 4 of the major hominin-bearing sites. And the sediment sandwiched in between the dated flowstones, then you can assign ages to that. And the sort of stars of the assemblages are the hominins who now also all have uranium-laid ages. And yeah, I suppose the more ages I calculated, the more I began to see patterns in the ages. And what I was saying earlier about the flowstones only forming under these specific conditions, that the cave has to be relatively closed and it needs to be raining more outside. And I was really curious about the possibility of using the flowstones to divide the sediments up and to use them as a tool to correlate between these localities in the same way that the volcanic tuffs are used in Eastern Africa. So they are used to date the sediments and the sequences, but also by fingerprinting them, you can actually work out where you are in the basin, particularly in time, by using the tuffs. And I wanted to see if we could use the flowstones in the same way. But flowstones are not volcanic tuffs. And so this is a model, a kind of idealized model of cave sort of stages in cave development. And it's a cyclic model. It doesn't really matter where you start. But if we jump in over here, where we've got the caves more or less closed to external material, it's raining a lot outside, it's a wet phase, and you've got a lot of flowstone forming in the cave. This cradle is a small area, so all the caves will be experiencing the same external hydroclimate conditions. So you would predict that flowstones of the same age will be forming in all the caves at the same time. Then the one thing we know about the climate in the Quaternary is that it doesn't stay the same for very long. And so we go into a drier climate phase, and with less rain, less vegetation, kind of opening up of the landscape, the cave entrances become more open, and you get a buildup of a soil profile, and it's not the Sahara. This is a drier phase, but it's not hyper arid. So you still get big rain events, and you would get things like flash floods washing the sediments and the bones into the caves. And this is consistent with the sedimentology of the deposits we see in the caves, as well as some of the taphonomy of the fossils. Then if we just keep going round on the cycle, then inevitably the climate begins to get wetter again. You go back into a wet phase with more vegetation, more rain, which in turn leads to the caves being closed off again, and you go back into kind of flowstone formation mode. And this model can explain the field observations of those stacked layers of flowstone sediment. And as I said, the big thing is we can date the flowstones. So we can date the time periods which were conducive to flowstone formation. So yeah, this is an updated version. This is the sort of 2019 state of play, where a lot more sites had been dated by this stage. I'd added Dremelin, Haasgat, Hoogland, Boltzfarm, and had, n equals 29, which is it's not a big number, but I mean, it took 10 years to produce these data. And on this plot, we've got the age from 3.4 to 1 million years. Each one of these box and whisker plots is the actual uranium laid age and the full 2 sigma era. And then this smooth curve is a kernel density estimate, which is a way of summing together the ages and their errors. And sitting behind the KDE is just a simple histogram. And the high bars on the histogram and the peaks of the KDE are periods where we get flowstone formation. So we can see in the field that we get alternating flowstone sediment accumulation. And then by dating the flowstones, we could actually date these flowstone growth intervals. And there's 6 of them between 3.2 and 1.2 million years, which wasn't a surprise, but it's very useful then in terms of linking the caves together. And here at this time period of around 2.2 million years, we have 5 different localities in the cradle with speleotherms or flowstones of the same age. So we are seeing this regional signal. And then the times in between, so the troughs in the KDE, these are the windows of time in which the sediments are accumulating in the caves. Because our very simplistic model is that flowstone and sediment are basically mutually exclusive, and you're not going to get them occurring. You're not going to get great sediment stacks and great flowstones forming at the same time. So all the existing sedimentary units in the cradle and all the existing biochronological ages fall within this framework and could be accommodated, which was a relief. Okay. Computer is hanging a little bit. So yeah, while my computer catches up with me, I hope it will just go on to the next slide. The implications for the fossil record are that it's highly punctuated. So we don't actually have a continuous record from 3 to 1 million years in the cradle. We have these brief, distinct time windows in which we are kind of punching through and seeing who was running around on the landscape during those times, and that these are also drier times, and that these wetter times, when we have flowstones forming, we don't actually have a fossil record for these times. And so we don't actually know what the fauna in the cradle looked like during wetter times. And everything we know about the South African fauna actually carries a dry bias. And my presentation is still not moving. I'm sorry. This is excruciating. I'm sorry, guys. I'm just going to stop sharing just for a moment to see if I can get this to move forward.
Yeah, that's fine, Robyn. If you need to reset it, that's okay. No worries.
I feel like it's such a 2020 thing to happen. It's like, come on. Okay. All right. That slide it got stuck on that slide. All right, I'm back.
Somebody here is saying that you can try resharing. That's what you're doing. Yeah.
Yes, I'm back. Okay. Yeah. I think I'm all good now. Yes. Okay. So this slide is just saying what I was saying before, that the record is punctuated. It's doing the same thing again to me. I don't know why it was fine with me moving forward and now it doesn't like it.
And you want to try resharing again just to see if...
Yeah. Technical difficulties.
Yeah, but that's okay.
Oh, it's really messing me around. Okay, here is Zoom. Let me try again.
So, Robyn, yeah, they're asking me here, when you're not in the presentation mode, does it move forward?
Yes. Oh no, it's working again now.
Okay.
So let's see. Let's, like, fingers crossed. So I'll have to speed up a little bit. I'm really sorry, everybody.
Okay.
So these are big, bold things that we've said about the Cradle of Humankind, that the caves are closed, that it's wet. And so the next big question is, we set up a lot of hypotheses in the 2019 paper, and how do you test the hypotheses? So the answer to how do you test the hypotheses is you get two phenomenal postdocs and make them do it. So Tara Edwards and Rina Kovic are my two, like, dream postdocs. They're both carbonate geologists and speleologists and isotope geochemists. And they are working on a collection of younger material from the Cradle of Humankind. So one of them is this incredibly beautiful, enormous stalagmite, which is Holocene. And we're working on the stable isotope record, the carbon and oxygen record, a very detailed record, as well as a trace element record, to get an idea of what this looks like in something as young as the Holocene. And then to go back to these old cradle flowstones and get an idea of what it was actually like during these wet phases. And Tara is doing more work on the digenetic signals as well. And then, yeah, the good news is that there's lots of other carbonates on the landscape out of the caves. You're by no means limited to working in caves. And so, yeah, I've done quite a lot of experimental work on pedogenic carbonates, calcretes, which are very difficult to date. And yeah, I'm not actually going to talk about them today. We've had some very encouraging results, and you can see there's a little time sequence of uranium thorium ages, but yeah, that's a discussion for another time. But the other big place that I've been working is in the Southern Kalahari, and it's not a place where you would expect. I wasn't really expecting to find a lot of carbonate in the Southern Kalahari. And it's a different time period. This is where we need to jump forward in time to the Middle Stone Age. And South Africa has this incredible record of the Middle Stone Age. And the most well-known localities are all along the Southern Cape Coast. And this really beautiful, detailed archaeological record, which is where we see the beginnings of modern humans and this kind of cultural modernity. And the main hypothesis driving the emergence of modern humans has been this reliance on marine resources, and that there's this link between the coastal setting and modern human behavior. But again, how do you actually test this hypothesis? And the way you test this hypothesis is that you go away from the coast and you go and look in the arid interior as far away from the coast as possible, to see if you can find modern humans. And if indeed there is this link with the coast, then we shouldn't find people, Middle Stone Age people, in the interior of South Africa that should be empty. And that was certainly the argument, was that during full glacials, the interior of South Africa is too cold, it's too dry, it's very inhospitable, and it's not very nice, and you wouldn't find modern people there. The smart modern humans were all down here on the coast. So our field area, and this is a project led by Ben Scoville and Jane Wilkins, is around the South African town of Kuruman in the Kuruman Hills. And this is a map. You can see the elevation and particularly the mean annual precipitation just on a rainbow scale, where the warm colors are almost no rain at all as you move across into the Kalahari. So sitting here is our rock shelter site of Kamohana, which sits at this very interesting interface between up to 600 millimeters of rain and this very sharp gradient, this very sharp drop off into the arid Kalahari. And this is what Khamahana looks like. It's this beautiful hillside. Here, this is all dolomite. It's the same host rock as in the cradle. And here you can see this enormous rock shelter. And there's been an excavation in the rock shelter, which started in 2016. And the first thing when I went to visit the site, my first impression was all of this sort of white stuff that you can see on the landscape. And there's a lovely diagram here where you can see all of the this carbonate material covering the it's secondary carbonate covering the dolomite. And I had never seen anything like this in the cradle. And this is tufa, so fresh water, sort of ambient temperature carbonate, which also only forms in quite specific depositional environments today, and it's not forming now. But you need to have a positive water balance, quite a lot of microbial interaction, flowing water. And today, this is the edge of the Kalahari Desert. So this was a big puzzle, was to try and understand these tufas. And yeah, obviously we wanted to try and date them as well. And in comes two other wonderful students of mine, Wendy Kamalo and Jess van der Meeden, who really led this work in the Southern Kalahari while I was having a baby. And these are the excavations at Khamahana. And the big thing to take away is that there's three main depositional layers, and they're around 100,000 at the bottom, 31,000 in the middle, and 15,000 at the top. And there's an incredibly rich archaeological sequence all the way through. And one of the most exciting and intriguing discoveries is in the lowermost 105,000-year-old age layer are 22 of these unworked calcite crystals. They're beautiful. They're just aesthetically very pleasing, white rhombohedron calcite crystals. And the big question was, how did these crystals get into the archaeological sediments? So as the geologist on the project, this was my problem. And I could sort of come up with a couple of potential explanations and then sort of shoot them down. So the one was that these crystals were washed into the deposits, but we find absolutely no evidence of water moving through the archaeological sediments. The main accumulation agent is people. These are anthropogenic sediments. We can tell from the orientations of all the plotted finds that there's been no deposition by water. There's been no disturbance by water. So it was quite easy to rule out these crystals being washed in. Then another compelling argument is that the crystals have weathered out of the host rock dolomite and just fallen into the deposits. So we did an extensive survey around the rock shelter and documented all the calcite that we could find. And it's a little bit difficult to see on this photograph, but these white arrows are showing these thin calcite veins running through the host rock dolomite. And here's a sort of close-up again of this veining of calcite. But these veins are, 1, 2, maybe 2 centimeters at the maximum. And the calcite that you find is these very typical bladed fragmentary calcite crystals. And this just visually looks very different to the calcite that we're finding in the deposits. And the shelter has certainly undergone erosion and roof blocks have fallen in, but there's no visible veins in the roof blocks in the shelter today. And it just seems unlikely that the vein calcite in the roof of the shelter is the source of these calcite crystals. So we can cross that out. And then another possibility is that these crystals are growing in situ, and this is not crazy. We do see something like gypsum, which is a hydrated carbonate forming in archaeological sediments. But again, gypsum has a very specific crystal habit, and we know what it looks like. And these crystals don't look anything like gypsum. So we could argue against the in situ formation. And What we did find then in our continued foot survey was about 5 kilometers away from the rock shelter. We found in this little, we call them koppies in South Africa, little hillside, this huge, great big vein of calcite. And here you can see, this is the piece we found, and you can see it's easy to imagine that those calcite crystals in the archaeological sediments were collected from somewhere like this. And I did a series of analysis of the archaeological crystals and this naturally, locally occurring crystal. And it wasn't possible to date them, but geochemically, they have the same fingerprint. So what we do in the paper is that we argue that the calcite crystals found in the archaeological sediments were deliberately collected by people, and they actually occur in the sediments as a little cache, the 22 crystals, and that there's a local source, but it's about 5 kilometers away. So these crystals were deliberately collected and curated and taken back to the shelter and discarded as this little cache. And we argue in the paper that this is a sign of complex symbolic behavior. The other thing that we find an abundance of in the archaeological sediments, particularly in this 100,000-year-old layer, are ostrich eggshells. And there's evidence that they were cooked. And this is also evidence that they were collected by people in anthropogenic origin. And this is a very busy plot. But here we have all of Southern Africa, and before around 110,000 years, there's very little convincing evidence of the deliberate collection of ostrich eggshells by people. And there's plenty of evidence from younger than 100,000 years of ostrich eggshells being used as water carriers and a food source. But sitting here at 105, gives us at Hamahana some of the oldest evidence of the collection of ostrich eggshells by people. So altogether, this gives us a very strong signal of complex modern human behavior over 600 kilometers away from the coast. So the coastal hypothesis is already starting to look a bit shaky. But the big question is, what are people doing in the Kalahari? It's a tough place to live now. So what was it like in the past? What was drawing people there? And this is where the Tufas come in. So these are just some field photographs of the diversity of Tufas that my student Jess identified on the landscape. And there's a full suite of sort of cascades, terraces, domes, these incredibly beautiful Tufas. And Jess has classified them together into this continuum of tufa, and this is from water flowing over the steps in the dolomite. And the turbulent flow of the water causes degassing of the CO2, and you basically get carbonate kind of falling out of solution, and these carbonates building out on top of the bedrock and around the rock shelter. And what we're seeing here, basically, what Jess is standing next to this huge example, you can think of it like a fossil waterfall, basically. When this formed, there would have been water cascading down these terraced steps of dolomite. And these are just more sort of gratuitous pictures of, this is a little rim, so there would have been a pool of standing water here and then flowing down. And we had some success in dating the Tufas, but we were getting Holocene ages. So we were anxious to try and get to the oldest Tufa deposits. So this is the dolomite wall, and here you can see a cascade right up against it. So we drilled little cores in to get to the kind of contact between the dolomite and the beginning of the Tufa formation. And these are some of Jessica's little cores, and she used very careful laser ablation to map the uranium and thorium distributions to pick these domains, sort of sub-centimeter domains. Tufa is notoriously difficult to date, where we had dense, sort of well-preserved tufa with enough uranium to date. And And the short answer is that, yeah, Jess was able to date a whole series of these tufas. The tufa formation is not continuous over the last 100,000 years old. And the amazing piece of the puzzle was that between 100 and 110,000 years ago, we get this big peak of tufa formation. And this is exactly the same time as the oldest archaeological layers and the kind of cache of calcite crystals. So these smart, adaptable, early modern humans were choosing to live at Khamohana during this time when there would have been waterfalls cascading down the hillside. And we know from the fauna that there was, abundant big game, and these people weren't eking out a living in a miserable, dry interior. This was a thriving ecosystem with abundant water on the landscape, which really challenges the previously held view of what the interior of South Africa was like. And Wendy Kamalo, my other student who is a paleoclimatologist, she used some marine core data from off the east coast of South Africa and on the other side of the Indian Ocean. And she showed from these marine cores that there's a brief warm period in the Indian Ocean, which also correlates to this 100 and 110 time window. And a slightly warmer Indian Ocean would increase the rainfall enough to be the driver, basically, of the additional rainfall that is feeding the tufa formation. So we could kind of piece together, by using the carbonates, what the paleo environment was like during the occupation of the shelter. So that's the end of the sort of, now my comfort zone of talking about carbonates and archaeology and chronology and technique development. And now I'm going to head off into more uncomfortable, uncharted waters, but not for very long. It's all right. So as I mentioned in the beginning, talking about what is decolonization. So there's many definitions, and I encourage you all to read around this topic. But the one that I like the most is the active resistance against colonial powers. And that this process occurs politically, but also applies to the personal and societal, cultural, political, and educational. And as researchers who work at universities, we fall into this educational sphere. And so working in education and personally, this deconstruction of colonial oppression is actually applicable to all of us. And you might be thinking, why am I doing this? Why am I leaving the comfortable space of carbonates and chronology? And I mean, I've asked myself this question a lot, but I think it depends how you see science, and whether if you see science and the sort of research endeavor as this thing which sits by itself and as this kind of pursuit alone, or if you see science as part of a bigger picture where science is a cog in the sort of wheel of its context and its society. And that not everyone has equal access to science, and the society and the context has actually a huge role on the science that is done, and who is doing that science, and who's asking the research questions, who's controlling the budget, who's making the decisions. And when you start to think of it, the more you think about it like this, the less you can accept that science is this kind of noble pursuit happening above society. Science is very much embedded in the society and the context. So this is what paleoanthropology in South Africa looks like. So Raymond Dart first described the town child in 1926. And many brilliant scientists have worked on the fossils in South Africa, but I think you can see a pattern here that, other than it's very necessary apparently to hold a skull, but this picture shows that white men who are not born in South Africa are successful at doing paleoanthropology in South Africa. Philip Tobias and Basil Cook are both South Africans, but they are a minority in this picture. And at this stage, I have to talk a little bit about myself. So I'm obviously a white South African. My family I'm the product of colonizers coming to South Africa in the 1600s and the 1800s. I had a very privileged, easy middle-class childhood in Johannesburg during the end of apartheid. These are some photos that my mum sent me. So I've had the same haircut my whole life. And my dad, bless him, wore some very short shorts in the early 80s. But sort of, joking aside, I had an incredible access to education. My parents worked hard, but there's a huge amount of privilege. And I had a huge leg up and a very easy start in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary education. And so while I'm a geologist, and geology is certainly male dominated, as a woman in science and a woman in geology, I actually don't represent a minority. My whiteness and the ease with which I move through the world as a white woman, particularly one with a British passport, is very different to the experience of most South African scientists. Why is this important? This becomes important when you are thinking about a whole lot of other really big words. And I don't love this graphic. I think this is an American softball game. But for now, just stay with me. These are thinking about things like equality, equity, where you give these guys want to be involved in the game, but there's literally a barrier holding them back. And they have an uneven starting point. So equity is where you give previously disadvantaged people a bit of a leg up, but there's actually still a massive barrier here. Then liberation is the removal of barriers, and then inclusion is everyone kind of being on the same team. And I certainly, in my own research and building my own research teams, my aspirations are towards inclusion. But to be able to do that properly, I have to, even as an individual, acknowledge my enormous privilege as a starting place. So I showed you, and I've been heavily criticized in the past for showing that picture of who has been successful doing paleoanthropology in South Africa. But this is what paleoanthropology leadership looks like in South Africa today in 2022. And you can see that this is a very different looking picture. These are all women. These are all South African women. There's only 3 white women. But it's interesting that the majority of these women are at museums, not universities. There's something to do with museums being, somehow less threatening a place for a woman to be in a leadership position. But this is a very encouraging picture, and it's a great privilege to work with these women. And there's a lot to feel a bit sort of depressed about with decolonization. But I wanted to end off with trying to be a bit more positive, is that what can we all actually do as individuals? And so much of this conversation comes back to the work that actually falls on us as particularly white people to actually do. So language matters, and the language that you use, and some sensitivity about language is important. So for example, Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent, which has a lot of countries in it. And Africa is very big. So this is a map, showing the US, China, India, basically all of Europe, very easily fitting into the continent of Africa. And so, for example, if you are going to do field work, I've heard many colleagues say they're going to Africa for the summer to do field work. I guarantee you are not going to Africa. You're going to Ethiopia or Angola or Namibia. And I suppose people feel that their audience, if they say, I'm going to Ethiopia, the person that you're explaining this to won't know where Ethiopia is. But it's actually on you to explain to them where Ethiopia is. and to not treat Africa as the heart of darkness by saying, I'm going to do fieldwork in Africa. This is an example of neo-colonialism, of treating Africa as just this homogenous mass, which is, a country and has no internal sort of differentiation. So please don't do that. Another example of language are outdated colonial terminology. So this is a map. I think this map it's not that old. I think it's from the 1930s. And this is a colonial map of Africa. So the different bright colors are the different European powers that controlled those parts of Africa. So this pink is the former British colonies. And it was certainly Cecil John Rhodes's dream was for all of Africa to be pink. And yeah, he did pretty well. I mean, they did it as colonialists. They was very successful. But if you look up here, so this whole area here is called British East Africa. So this region, particularly in human evolution, is the subject of a lot of research, and even in recent literature is referred to as East Africa. But East Africa is actually a horrible old colonial term. And what you're talking about when you're talking about the fossil record of Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania is a region, a geographical region, which is actually Eastern Africa. So just by using language slightly differently, you can not use horrible old colonial language. And I mean, there's lots to talk about extractive field practices. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole now, but there's wonderful examples, and there's great projects like Susanna and Renee's project in Mozambique, where you're building real long-term collaborations and building, physical and human capacity. And these kind of inclusive field practices and study design is the future. That's where we have to go. This was just some reading recommendations. Darwin's Hunch is a very confronting book about human evolution in South Africa. And then what we're doing at the University of Cape Town is our Human Evolution Research Institute is founded on principles of inclusivity, and by building diverse teams deliberately, and by creating a welcoming, inclusive environment, that this can be one where anyone can just do their research. And we're doing our best to kind of remove obvious barriers. And it's certainly, there's not a lack of women in the field. We don't need to get little girls excited about science. We need to give them positive experiences during their training. So that is what we are doing at HERI. And we have a program called Advancing Women. We have two PhD students who are part of this program, Precious and Reveningo. And before the pandemic ruined everything, we ran an all-women's field camp for our undergraduates from geology and archaeology, to give them an informative, safe and fun field experience with a view to retaining them in the discipline of human evolution. To wrap up, and I think you've definitely heard enough from me. South Africa has this rich record of carbonates associated with important human evolution sites. Uranium series, uranium lead, and uranium thorium is this very useful chronometer to provide ages and environmental context for these sites. Both the uranium lead and uranium thorium chronometers are undergoing constant development. And I hope I was able to explain some of the sort of cutting edge of this development work today. Understanding the paleoenvironmental signals inherent in these carbonates is fascinating but complex, and we're actively working on this. And then Africa holds this rich record of human evolution, but historically many voices have been left out of the telling of the story. And as I was saying, there's no quick fix to decolonization. There's no silver bullet, but doing nothing makes things worse. So I believe we're going into a challenging but really exciting new era in our field of human evolution. And by being part of the change, being part of the solution is I hope, exciting and challenging, and the future that I would really like to see for our field. This is a massive list of acknowledgements. I'd particularly like to acknowledge my research, my young research colleagues and my group at the University of Cape Town. And I'd particularly also like to give a shout out to my au pair, Shakira, who is controlling my 2 small children in the room next door to this. I'd like to thank you all for your attention. And I really hope you have some questions. I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Robyn. Really absolutely fascinating talk. We have in the chat function in YouTube a series of questions and comments. So I think you mentioned you do have a bit of time.
Yes.
Just to let you know, we have colleagues saying this is a fascinating talk. Thank you so much for sharing with us and discussing all these very important topics. Comment here from Paula Shepard, for example, saying, thank you for highlighting these very important issues of decolonization. This conversation is long overdue. So several comments and questions that we have here in the chat section, Robyn. Many of them saying
let's go. Give me a nice easy one, Renee.
Very inspiring talk. On the last topic, we have a question here saying there are many challenges with inclusion, ethics, equality, diversity, and there's much work going on. But what would be for you the number one aspect that we can tackle that is most pressing for those of us in academia, in academics, if we can address that?
Wow. That's a hard question, because I think as academics, we like to kind of ramble away and talk very generally. So thank you very much. It's a wonderful question to try and distill down to like, what's the one thing? I think in my opinion, the biggest thing for us in South Africa is funding for postgraduates. So we have a generous national research foundation. We have several NGOs that also fund generously, but the cost of living in somewhere like Cape Town is high. And there's a big gap between what the university calls the full cost of attendance and the bursary that the students get. So there's this kind of assumption that somehow, I don't know, the parent bank, your mom and dad will help you out, you'll live at home. But that is not the experience of the majority of our undergraduates. UCT is a residential university, and Cape Town is an expensive city. And so this becomes a barrier for many students, the gap between, and these are the brightest students in Africa. They are super smart and super motivated, but they actually can't afford to do postgraduate studies. So that would be, and what I find frustrating is that this is easy to fix. This is not a lot of pounds or euros or dollars. It's not even a lot of rands. So that would be my one thing that I would like to see change fast.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and one that we have experienced directly here in Oxford, bringing students from Africa as well. So we completely understand.
Yes, and Oxford's also an expensive city to live, right? And it's your actual life, and it's so stressful. You can't be expected just to push back the frontiers of science if you are, literally can't pay your rent, So.
Yeah. We found that at the institutional level, some of these institutions are not yet aware or prepared to be able to reach out in the ways that you are suggesting. So it takes not just the personal changes and actions that you're advocating, but also changes at an institutional level.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Again, with the themes going in reverse order, we have a question here about the Southern Kalahari from Gonzalo Linares, and the question here is if these pieces were brought in by people, were the calcite crystals found randomly scattered in several spatial clusters? What is the distribution of the calcite crystals.
Yeah, it's amazing. We actually find them throughout the sediment. So in the younger deposits, in the middle deposit, but the majority of the crystals are found in that lower layer. And they are isolated crystals throughout, but some of them are big. The biggest ones are kind of this size. And the biggest and most beautiful crystals are that 22, and they're in a cache. They're in a little collection that would fit. It's about, Ben Scoville is American, and he said it's about the size of I don't want to get the wrong ball, I think of a baseball. So yes, they are found in a discrete little collection.
And again, now going towards the first part of the talk on the cradle. One of the questions is, you've identified a series of dry intervals when the fossils would have been deposited, right, into the caves. How do these intervals correspond at all with some of the dry intervals that have been identified or tentatively identified in Eastern Africa?
So, I mean, I love this question, and I'm obsessed with this, and I wish I had an easy answer for you, but no, there's no neat, easy answer. I have plotted everything, every graph that Rick Potts has drawn in his life, I have plotted against mine. I've tortured Tyler Faith and Dave Braun with this question for years, and no, there's no simple picture. Some, yes, some overlap, but not all of them overlap. There's phases of big lake expansion all over Eastern Africa, particularly in Kenya, and some of those big lakes correspond to my big flowstones, but there's no simple picture, which I found very frustrating for years. And in that article, we had to just back off trying to discuss this. But I think my explanation is that these regions are thousands of kilometers apart. They're on other sides of a continent, and they actually experience very different climate regimes, right? And so in the cradle, we're in the summer rainfall region, and it was maybe a bit naive to expect that they would somehow, my dry phases would just link up. The cradle dry phases are much longer. It's also hundreds of thousands of years, while the Eastern African record is much finer resolution now, because it's had decades more research. So yeah, I've only got a messy answer for this, and it's just really messy. And yeah, I'm completely fascinated by this. And I think what will happen with the work we're doing on these big flowstones is the more we can understand about these wet intervals, like how long they actually are and how much variability is happening in those wet phases, that then we'll be able to start doing more apples and apples comparison with the Eastern African record. At the moment, it's too much apples and oranges. But thank you. That's a wonderful question. And yeah, I'm obsessed with this.
Another question that we have is about using complementary dating methods. So what would be some other methods that can be used in tandem with what you're doing that may corroborate the dates that you're getting for the cradle, as well as for the Southern Kalahari?
Yeah, and I want to start with the sort of very clear message that I love multi-dating studies. I'm not someone who's wedded to my technique. I think having more than one chronometer on the landscape and at sites is enormously important. I really don't like either of these chronologies kind of hanging on just the uranium series. So I mean, in the Southern Kalahari, it was quite easy because we could just do normal optically stimulated luminescence on the archaeological sediments, which was straightforward and is a well-established technique. And we had this beautiful synergy with the tufa formation windows and occupation horizons. But in the cradle, it's more challenging because the deposits are older. So there's been some work on cosmogenic burial isotopes, beryllium and aluminium. But this was at the very early days of the technique. There's lots of, yeah, there's more than one way to like skin that cat and crunch those numbers. And the one thing we actually know about these sediments in the caves is that they have complex histories. They get knocked around inside the caves, and that there's been a lot of surface erosion. So the system is really complex, and you actually need to capture that complexity when you do the calculations. So the burial ages in the cradle have yet to produce an age which is even vaguely in the same ballpark as the uranium lead. So it's like a textbook example of like badly designed science, where these methods haven't been developed, or you've taken an experimental technique and rushed off and dated an unknown, instead of taking an experimental technique and dating something that is known and then dating the most exciting unknown, which was the cradle. But then with other dating techniques, yes, I mean, if we could date the fossils, that would change everything. And something like uranium lead dating on enamel it's not routine, it's very experimental. I'm yet to see any data that convinces me, but that is a frontier, which is, you know, I hope in our lifetime, like someone will crack that. There's really amazing luminescence dating being done actually in Oxford, and now at Stony Brook, doing kind of long-lived electron traps in quartz to go back millions of years and do burial dating with OSL and infrared, you know, using, I don't know enough about it to speak with any authority, but that is hugely exciting. And I think that's the way to date the sediments. What else? Yeah, I think that would be my two predictions where this field will hopefully rapidly change in the coming years.
Thank you, Robyn. And you talked about diagenesis. One of the questions we have here is that in many cave contexts, there's abundant bat life dwelling in them. This is what we have in Gorongosa. The question is, would the presence of guano in some of these caves affect the dating using the uranium series in these contexts?
Yeah, that's such a cool question. I've never thought about that. Interestingly, we don't have a lot of bats living in the caves today. You know, you get the odd bat, but there's no like bat colonies in the cradle. And in the sediments, we certainly don't see guano as a deposit in the caves, but the caves were also mined. So it's possible just that we don't see that at all, like it was there and it's been removed. I think the question, what they're asking is that would the guano be affecting the flowstone and somehow messing with the chronometer? I don't know. I don't know what the digenetic signal of guano would look like, but I imagine that, you know, it's acidic enough to kind of recrystallize and kind of mess with the preservation of the flowstones. And yes, we do see flowstones that aren't well preserved. And I guess there's a huge collection bias in the material that's collected for dating by me, that I got better at selecting material that I knew would work. So very poorly preserved flowstone, which is obviously partly decomposed, I haven't tried to date. I've left that in the field. So I don't know if part of the reason, and we certainly do find, you know, decomposed is the best word that I can use, flowstone. And yeah, that could be a wonderful explanation that that's from some kind of, yeah, bat life in the cave. So my answer is, I don't know.
Very good. We have a question from Jennifer here about Makapanskat and Taung. So these appear in your maps. Of course, one is to the north, one is to the southwest of the cradle where you've focused. But do we know how these sites fit into the framework that you've laid out? And if so, yeah, how do we know how they might fit into this?
Yeah. Oh, this is such a great question. Thank you, audience. These are the best questions. I mean, I love this stuff. I could just talk. I know I said I wouldn't be able to talk long because I have to go and look after my kids, but now I'm like, no, I'll talk all night. So yeah, I've actually never been to Taung, and from what I've read and what I've been told, the setting is really quite different. It's a tufa, it's a spring mound. And yeah, there's some, I think mainly unpublished uranium lead work, not done by me, done by another group. And they were getting, off the top of my head, ages of around 2.6, which is one of my wet phases. And so, I mean, according to my model, the Taung and Makapan aren't that far away. I would anticipate the same wet and dry cycles, maybe for Taung, but it is a different depositional environment. But then Makapan, I mean, the commonality between Taung, Makapan, and the Cradle is the bedrock. It's all sitting on the same dolomite. And they're all in the summer rainfall region. So they have the setup to have the same signals preserved. Makapan is, that whole Makapan's valley is just not like, it's just not like the Cradle. It's just on a totally different scale. I actually find it completely overwhelming. And there's no published uranium lead work from Makapan, but Joe Walker at Leeds in the early 2000s did some beautiful uranium lead dating. And I've been there and collected samples, but then had babies and moved countries twice and haven't finished that analysis. But yeah, I mean, Makapan is just a much bigger system, but there's no reason why the same flowstone sediment model wouldn't work. The idea is that this is a very simple model that you can apply everywhere and then kind of layer in locality complexity to it. And everything we know about Makapan points to it being a bit older. So maybe Makapan can pick up this kind of 2.6 to 3 million signal that we see very weakly in the Cradle. We only see the big Cradle signals come in from 2.6 and younger, but maybe Makapan is picking up just a bit older. But I don't know. I mean, it's a wonderful place to go and work next.
Very good. If we can ask maybe just one more question before we let you go, Robyn. Well, your work has profound implications for the way that we understand the hominin record in the Cradle. And just one example of this is that some of the very early dates, for example, for the specimen, is it STW 573, I think, that
Littlefoot, yeah,
will be dated to close to almost 3.7 million years. According to your work, that would be almost 1 million years younger. Now, this has implications for dispersal events. So people have posed that if it is so early, that it may be directly linked to Eastern African species like Australopithecus anamensis, for instance, and that Prometheus, in this case, Australopithecus Prometheus, if that is a true taxon, that it could be a direct descendant from taxa like Australopithecus anamensis. So the way that I understand that is that your work now puts a much narrower time frame for all of these specimens from Sterkfontein and actually also more broadly from the Cradle, with various implications for understanding hominin speciation events, dispersal, and so on. What are your thoughts on this? I would imagine that being in South Africa, also talking about some of the social aspects of our science, this may not have, I don't know if it's been widely accepted in the context where you work, or what's the
you've saved the hard questions for the end.
The implications of this work, which are profound, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot of friends in South African paleoanthropology, and that 2019 paper was polarizing, basically, that the vast majority of people loved it and were like, we've waited for decades for something like this. But there was a minority of people who really don't like it at all, and are very resistant to the time implications and the dry bias implications. Bernard Wood has been very generous to me, and he said, you know, if you're getting in people's way, you must be doing something right. So yeah, there is definitely resistance. And I think, I mean, for me as a geologist, there's just no compelling evidence of anything older than 3 million, maybe 3.2 in the cradle. I mean, the oldest Speleotherms are 3.2, and the sediments are younger than that. And I've dated the bottom flowstone at all of these sites, except for Gondolin and Crom Dry, but everything at those sites points them to being younger anyway. So, and Tara Edwards, my colleague, we have a paper coming out where she's looking in detail at Bolt's Farm, which had biochronological ages, putting it between 4 and 5, maybe 4.5 million years. But Tara's done beautiful work on those deposits and can show with the stratigraphy, the paleomag, the uranium lead, that those deposits are really young. They're only about 1.8 million. So the body of evidence for the antiquity of the cradle is really just been eroded. As a geologist, there's just nothing really older than 3 million. So depending on how you calculate the burial ages for STW 573, I mean, even those burial ages have been recalculated to around 2.2 by Tebogo, Makubela, and Jan Kramers. So, and the uranium lead points to an age of 2.2 as well. So, yeah, the oldest material at Sterkfontein, in my opinion, is younger than 2.6 million. And that nothing in the cradle is much older than 3 million, which, yeah, changes this narrative of the antiquity of the South African material. But what it does do is it puts all the South African hominins and fauna actually in these narrow time windows, that we have huge diversity in narrow time windows. Whereas in Eastern Africa, you've got a time depth, but you've got this huge area and stuff is very dispersed, while our material is all very concentrated in space and time. So I'm basically trying to find like a positive spin on it all being younger. And yeah, it's like the kind of biogeography, paleobiogeography, how we fit everyone together now. Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I would love to think more about this. And we've tried with Paranthropus, because now Paranthropus is the one taxa that we get in Eastern Africa and South Africa. And so that's where you can compare apples and apples, and kind of look what Paranthropus is doing in these two regions in comparative times. We haven't actually done this. We've only talked about doing it, but yeah, these are the kind of frontiers. This is where I would really hope research goes. I don't have time to do all of this stuff, and I would love to see this as being kind of somebody else to test these models, basically.
And related to this, Robyn, the lack of sites or localities earlier than 3.2 million years in the cradle and elsewhere in South Africa, is that just a sampling issue? Are there any geological reasons or environmental reasons, perhaps? Yeah. Why
I don't know.
Sites from that time period, and essentially nothing prior to that until...
No, it's a great question here. It's like, what is going on in South Africa? I think it's too early to really make a call, but I think that's why dating Makapan and Taung is so important, to get proper ages for them. And I think trying to build, so my other PhD student, Riveningo Khoza, this is what her PhD is on, is trying to understand landscape development in South Africa. So she's looking at the Olifants River and the Orange River, so the big watersheds of South Africa, to try and understand how much landscape development there's been and how much landscape change, even in the last 5 million years. because we don't actually know. There's some very old hypotheses of like African land surfaces, and the main hypothesis is that there's been very little change to the landscape in Southern Africa, whereas, you know, in Eastern Africa, the model is that the surface has changed massively. There were huge lakes, they're not lakes now, there's a rift, whereas the model in South Africa has just been very stable and static, but we don't actually have numbers on that. We don't actually know if that is the case. So Riveningo is using beryllium and aluminium isotopes to actually date land surfaces and try and get a better handle on actual landscape development. And I think this will give us a clue to somewhere like the Cradle, like what is happening. We have a sense that there's actually been a lot of surface erosion. And in dolomite, you get just normal karst processes that you're constantly getting younger caves forming. And as the land surface erodes, you actually lose caves just through natural erosion. So that would be one explanation, is that there was older material in the Cradle and it's gone. There's no obvious relationship between the age of the sites in the Cradle and their current elevation. We've looked at all of this. So we don't really know. Again, it's just a kind of another puzzle. I wonder if there isn't some kind of a climate signal. We definitely see big shifts in global climates around about 2.6 million. And that somehow this window of caves being open and closed and flowstone and sediment, I describe it as like the sort of Goldilocks effect, like everything has to be just right. It can't be too wet, it can't be too dry. It's got to rain just the right amount in the right seasons. And that maybe those conditions were only just right. And maybe that only really starts at about 2.6 million years.
Very good, Robyn. Well, we won't take any more of your precious time. I think the kids are probably waiting there. But
they've gone very quiet. Netflix, the great like digital babysitter, right?
Thank you so much. It's been a fantastic talk, really brilliant, with lots of topics to think about, and we would love to continue the conversation live at some point. But we will leave it there again. Thank you, and I think we can stop the live broadcast now. For those who are
thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you to everyone for attending and the wonderful questions. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to, I would love next time for this to be in person and not on Zoom. So we'll get there. So thank you.
We'll get there. Thank you, Robyn. Thank you.